This is actually one of my favorite movies. In the movie Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Lawrence Jameson, who's played by Michael Caine, is a cultivated, suave master con artist who operates in the deluxe hotels along the French Riviera. Steve Martin plays a small-time American hustler named Freddie Benson who invades Jameson's territory, and the two con men begin kind of a contest for dominance as the master con artist of the area, while all the while they're ruthlessly sabotaging one another. The events that we're about to read show us that Jacob and Laban sort of have this kind of relationship with one another. The events of which we're about to read depict two cons, each trying to out-con the other. In the grace and providence of God, it will be Jacob who comes out the winner, but for reasons completely different from those which he expected. So let's take a look at it. Genesis 30, and we'll start here in verses 25 to 43. Let me find my place in my Bible. After Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I have done for you." But Laban said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." And Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all of your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. This is Laban who's doing this sorting, not Jacob. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, split up their flocks, so they're 3 days apart, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. When the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the men grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and maidservants and men servants and camels and donkeys. Well, that's not weird at all. So after the birth of Joseph, Jacob begins yearning for home. He approaches his father-in-law Laban about returning to Canaan. Laban doesn't want to lose Jacob because apparently he's learned through divination, he says, that he's prosperous because of Jacob. So he wants to keep Jacob there with him for prosperity reasons more than he does so for posterity reasons. The blessings of God upon Jacob have spilled over onto Laban, and he likes it like that. Up until now, all of Jacob's labor had been in lieu of a dowry. He's still paying off Leah and Rachel. He's working off a debt. He's not accumulating any wealth of his own. He had nothing to show for his labor except his wives and his family. So he does a contract renegotiation with Laban, who asked him what his terms would be. And Jacob proposes to continue pasturing Laban's flock for a while with the caveat that he is to be given all the spotted, speckled, and black sheep and all the spotted and speckled goats. This seems like a good deal to Laban because these animals are rarer. But wishing to hedge his bet, he goes through the flock, although Jacob had offered to do this. He removes all those animals himself. Then he puts his sons, Laban puts his sons in charge of Jacob's flock. Removing the spotted and speckled and striped, which were in the flock, benefited Laban by lessening the chances of other spotted or speckled or striped lambs and goats being conceived by his flock that he would then have to give over to Jacob, and he doesn't want to do that. He just wants him to give the ones he has now. He also, initially at least, keeps his flock 3 days' journey away from Jacob, so the two flocks cannot intermingle. In doing this, Laban hoped to prevent any shenanigans on Jacob's part. Apparently, his mistrust in his son-in-law is high. We learn later that Laban keeps changing the deal with Jacob concerning the arrangement because he is in desperation mode to offset any advantage that Jacob might have. He cannot figure out why Jacob entered into this deal. It seems to Laban that this is to Jacob's disadvantage. So he's very suspicious of why he entered into this deal. So then Jacob does this very strange thing with the stripping of the wood bark, which he places by the water troughs. And commentators are divided about why Jacob does this. Some say he does it superstitiously as a way to manipulate the situation. And some say, no, he's doing this as an expression, this is a symbol of his faith in God because of a dream he mentions later. Well, let's look at that for a moment from both angles. If he's doing this superstitiously, he seems to believe that by peeling the bark away and exposing the white wood underneath, he is making a stripe in that wood and thereby providing a visual impression on the mother at the time of conception, which he believes will affect the appearance of the animals conceived. In other words, the mothers would see the striped discoloration of the peeled bark at the watering troughs, and they would then produce striped or discolored offspring. So, summarize the words of Stevie Wonder, superstition ain't the way. But that's one theory about why Jacob has this breeding scheme. The other notes that Laban's name means white. That's what Laban means. And placing these wood poles with Laban white stripes in them, Jacob is expressing his confidence that God was going to stick it to Laban. I suppose a case could be made for either of these alternatives, as the text itself is somewhat vague and open to interpretation. Some say the superstition case is made stronger by verses 41 and 42. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches, but if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. This seems to suggest that Jacob thought there was something about the branches that caused this to happen. Otherwise, why is he placing them there and removing them. If it's just a symbol of his faith in God, why doesn't he just leave them there? But he's putting them out when the stronger animals are there, and he's taking them away when the weaker animals are there. But those who say, no, it's still a symbol of his faith in God, they jump to Genesis 31 and verse 10, where Jacob talks about a dream he had. He said, in breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. So they say, this is why he is doing this. Nevertheless, you'll note there in those verses, nothing is said by God about placing out branches with white stripes in them. So I guess, how you choose to interpret his actions depends on whether you want to attribute good or bad motives to Jacob or why he is doing this. I tend to think if you attribute bad motives to Jacob, you're right most of the time so far. Now, so if he did this superstitiously, which I believe he did, then he is still scheming and still leaning on his own understanding when it comes to fulfilling the will of God. He's trying to help God out. If he did it as an expression of faith, which I don't think he was, I guess he's learning to trust. Again, I tend to think it's superstitious based upon what we just read in verses 41 and 42 of Genesis 30. And we already know that there was superstition in the family because of the incident with the mandrakes between Rachel and Leah. Additionally, the fact that he's only putting out the striped barked poles when the stronger animals are around and taking them away when the weaker animals arrive suggests this is a superstition. Now, another phase of Jacob's plan is to predispose the outcome of his labors, which was to segregate the flocks. The striped, speckled, and spotted offspring, which belonged to Jacob, were put off by themselves. However, note the rest of the flock was faced towards those animals in Jacob's flock, or in Laban's flock, and which was originally 3 miles away. So I don't know if it's facing them toward them and they're still 3 miles away, or if that was taken off the table at some point. Let's take a look at Genesis 30:40. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Then he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Now, this is evidence of Laban changing the deal, because he now has somehow streaked and dark-colored animals when he supposedly removed all of those in the original deal and turned those over to Jacob. So something has happened where his animals are now producing these kind of sheep and goats and lambs again. Again, we see Jacob here. Again, I think it's superstitiously believing that by looking at those spotted and speckled and dark animals, it subliminally would cause his flocks to produce more of the same. Now, I suspect if you were to ask Jacob at the time why he was doing this, he might have attributed his success to a combination of his own ingenuity and the Lord's assistance. He is learning, though, but I don't think he's come to fully understand just yet that the blessings come from the Lord alone and not because of our ingenuity. In chapter 31, we'll be told the real reason for Jacob's prosperity. So let's take a look at that and read Genesis 31, verses 1 through 16. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent word for Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were spotted, streaked, speckled. The angel of God said to me here in the dream, Jacob, I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. Then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have a share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you to do. Now, two significant changes have occurred with Jacob since he arrived. The first change is that Jacob, who was originally penniless, has now become prosperous. And the second change is when Jacob first arrived, there was no mention of Laban having any sons. But now we've been told that Laban does have sons. Now, why is this significant? Well, you'll remember when Laban first meets Jacob, who becomes his son-in-law, in chapter 29, he says, as soon as Laban had heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said, you are my own flesh and blood. Now, if Laban didn't have any sons at this time, when he said this, he could adopt a near relative who would then become his heir. A son-in-law would be one such person that he could adopt to become his heir. If Laban only later had sons, then his inheritance would have to be divided among his sons plus Jacob in some fashion. This is at least a plausible explanation of the cause of the change in Laban's attitude toward Jacob and his family. Initially, Laban might have looked upon Jacob as his son, not knowing if he was going to have sons. And so he says, okay, Jacob will be my heir. But then later on, when he had sons of his own, he doesn't need Jacob anymore. In fact, Jacob is now a competitor with his own sons for the family inheritance. So Laban is on a little bit, he's emotionally conflicted. He wants Jacob around for financial reasons, while at the same time he wants to exclude Jacob from any inheritance. When Laban's sons see all of their inheritance dwindling as Jacob builds up his own wealth, then the tensions begin to mount. It is during this time that Jacob receives a divine directive that he is to return to the land. Now, before he could do all this, obviously, Jacob would need the support of his wives. They must choose between their father and their husband. In order to have a private conversation, he has them meet him out in the fields. He lays out his case against their father, telling them, look, your dad keeps changing my wages. He's changed the terms 10 times. He can't be trusted. They were familiar with the trait in their father, that he couldn't be trusted. It's how they became to be the wives of Jacob. He then credits God, or the God of his father, with vindicating him by giving him the flocks of Laban, which proved he was not at fault. Besides this, we saw that Jacob has his blessing confirmed in verses 10 to 13 through this dream, and he's directed to return to the land of promise. Leah and Rachel recognize that they are no longer in their father's favor, for when he sold them to Jacob, he did not offer them any of the proceeds from the dowry, which would have been customary. Customarily, Laban would have received the dowry and given some of those proceeds to his daughters, but this he did not do. This is what Rachel and Leah mean when they say, our father has treated us like foreigners rather than like daughters. Therefore, they have not benefited from the work that Jacob has done for their father either. Nobody has benefited except Laban. So both Rachel and Leah agree to return with Jacob to the land of promise. Now, let's discuss applications of what we've read today. Some of this has to do with prosperity and wealth. And I think Christians have always been of two minds when it comes to financial blessings. There are those who believe that and teach that financial prosperity is a divine right, so long as one follows certain faith formulas. There are also those who would argue that conspicuous material wealth is incompatible with the Christian faith and exhort Christians to give away everything they have and to live at a mere subsistence level. Now, what these two mindsets have in common is they both seem to create confusion and guilt. I'm either not wealthy enough because my faith is weak, or I'm far too wealthy for my own good, but will not part with my material possessions because my faith is weak. So it's a lose-lose for me. If you go back to Jacob's experience at Bethel, you find that God promised to give Jacob the land of Canaan and to multiply his descendants in fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. But God wasn't merely choosing to bless Jacob for Jacob's sake, and this is the thing that Jacob always forgets. The purpose to bless Jacob was for him to prosper in order for him to become a channel of blessing to other people. I think Jacob is gaining insight as to his position of blessing. He understands he's being blessed, but he's still confused over why. The first thing he needs to learn, which he's not yet learned, is that blessings come from the Lord as gifts, not as rewards for our ingenuity, hard work, or wisdom. God blesses Jacob because of who he is and the promises that he's made to him, not because of what Jacob does. Jacob seems to have partially realized this principle as he prepares to leave. In verse 31:5, he tells his wives, "The God of my father has been with me," so he recognizes that. In verse 7, he says, "God did not allow Laban to hurt me," so he recognizes God in that. And in verse 9, he says, "God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me." So he is definitely on the right track because he's making reference to all that God has done for him rather than what he has done for God. I refer to his understanding as partial, though, because the scheming side of Jacob's personality is still quite evident. It seems to me he's still prone to try to assist God in blessing him. I cannot help but be reminded of Paul's exhortation to the church at Corinth in chapter 3 and verse 5, where Paul writes, "What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor." The Corinthians, like some Christians today, seem to be under the impression that the efforts of men were their source of blessing. If I do certain things, the Lord will bless me. Paul says, look, only God is the source of blessing, and ministers, such as Paul and Apollos and myself, are only servants accountable to him. When you go out to dinner, you don't usually wax eloquent about the waiter whose only task was to bring the food to your table. The waiter is not the source of the meal. You don't say, "My compliments to the waiter." You say, "My compliments to the chef." Well, Paul and Apollos and Jeff were only waiters. We are not the chef. Paul was used by God to plant a church. But you know what Paul could not do? He could not make it grow. Apollos watered the church planted by Paul. But you know what Apollos could not do? He could not make it grow. Only God makes things grow. But as a pastor, I can tell you, I receive all kinds of literature telling me it is possible for me to make the church grow. And occasionally these same people indicate that it might be my fault that the church is not growing. Well, let's say for the sake of argument that I could actually figure out a way to put on some kind of dog and pony show that would bring a lot of people here to Dove Creek. Our problem would be this. Is Pastor Kaz's growth really growth? And is it the kind of growth we want? Do I really believe that God alone produces the results? If pastors really believe that God alone produces results, they would not be so anxious as they appear to get when their churches aren't growing and when others might label them a failure. Now, whenever a church is growing, other pastors come out of the woodwork and ask that pastor, "What did you do?" If the pastor is successful enough, he writes a book about what he did. And he tries to convince others that they can do it too. Now, I guarantee you that if the Lord were ever of the mind to bless our little congregation, you're never going to see me going around telling others what I did to make it grow. This church may grow in spite of me, but this church will never grow because of me. In fact, right now, sadly, the only seminar I am currently qualified to teach would be Stopping Momentum Before It's Too Late. That's the only one I'm qualified to teach. So, fortunately, I've been able to stop it. So, when someone asks me about my church growth strategy, I don't really have one. God is my only growth strategy. My promise to the Lord was simply to shepherd the sheep that show up. God causes growth, and he will cause this church to grow and other churches to grow when and if he's of a mind to do it. The danger now is that everything that I have just said may have sounded to you like humility. It's not humility. It's just honesty. To me, accepting that God causes growth relieves me of feeling the pressure to make the church grow. I rarely feel pressure to make this church grow anymore. Unfortunately for you, I've grown incredibly comfortable with preaching mediocre sermons. It's just, it's just what happens. Like, I used to worry about it, and now it's like, whatever. Now, I wish I could say I never worry about it, but that would be what the Bible calls lying. So the blessings of God are gifts. They're not rewards. A church that is growing is not because God is rewarding that pastor or that church for something that they're doing. We may one day be rewarded, but we will be rewarded based upon our faithfulness, not our fruitfulness. Because God has not called us to be fruitful. He's called us to be faithful. And so long as you are faithful to whatever God has called you to do, you're going to be just as rewarded as the person who has the most fruitful ministry you can think of. But I don't think Jacob has learned this lesson quite yet. It's a hard lesson to learn. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking that blessings are God's rewards. And I don't think he has quite learned the second lesson as well, and that is God blesses his purposes, not ours. I think spiritual gifts are sort of a good example of this principle. Why did you get a spiritual gift? If you're a believer, the Bible says you were given a spiritual gift. Why did God give you a spiritual gift? A gift is given to you, but the gift is not for you. The gift is for others. You are given a gift so that you can be a gift to others in the congregation. And they are given gifts for that very same reason. God blesses us so that we might bless others. The Lord is calling Jacob back to his purpose, not simply to be blessed, but to become a blessing. I'm not sure that Jacob understands this. It appears to me he's inclined to enjoy the blessings and forget about the purpose of those blessings to become a blessing to others. So the blessings which God gives his people are never to be misspent on selfish living, but rather to be paid forward in blessing others. Now, ask yourself this question. Be honest. What do you really want from God? Do you want blessings? Or do you want to be a blessing? Man, I thought about that a lot this week. Now, we all know we're supposed to say, oh, I would rather be a blessing than be blessed. But what I discovered about myself is that that's not how I pray. I don't pray that way, if I'm being honest. As I thought back over the years of my life, I think more of my prayers were for simply blessings from God. So I prayed, Lord, bless my family. Lord, bless my children. Lord, bless our little church. Bless my friends. Bless our ministry work in this area and that area. In hindsight, I wish more of my prayers had been along the lines of, Lord, make my family a blessing to others. Lord, make my children a blessing to others. Lord, make Dove Creek a blessing to others. Being blessed only makes sense if we use it to become a channel of blessing to others. Am I a channel of blessing? Or do I squander the blessings of God on myself? When you learn to pay forward the blessings that God has given to you and bless others, then you are twice blessed. Amen? Amen. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, as we consider now your word, and the prayer partners go to the back. If anybody would like to be prayed with or for, the prayer partners are in the back during this last song to pray with you and for you. Lord, I am convicted over the fact that I have spent very little of my prayer life asking to be a blessing to others. And I have spent much of my prayer life asking you to bless me or someone I love in some form or fashion. And maybe the lesson that Jacob hasn't learned yet is also a lesson that I haven't quite learned yet. That the only true purpose in receiving blessings is to use them to be a blessing to others. Not simply to enjoy the blessings of God for ourselves. We need to redirect our minds. We need to redirect our focus. And I think if we do, we will discover the truth that there's an even better blessing in being a blessing than there is in receiving a blessing. Lord, may we take that to heart this day. We thank you and praise you for all these things. It is in Jesus' name we pray, and all God's people said.